Number 15. The Kidnapping of Carlina White. Carlina White was born on July 15, 1987, at Harlem Hospital in New York City, to parents Joy White and Carl Tyson. Like any new parents, Joy and Carl were filled with hope and dreams for their newborn daughter. However, their joy turned into unimaginable sorrow just 19 days later. On August 4, 1987, Carlina was readmitted to the hospital from which she had recently come home with a high fever. During her stay, an unidentified woman dressed as a nurse approached Joy, offering comfort and advice. Trusting her, Joy left Carlina in the woman's care briefly. That would be the last time Joy would see her daughter for over 20 years. The woman, who would later be identified as Ann Petway, took Carlina from the hospital. Despite a massive manhunt and widespread media coverage, including an appeal on the television show America's Most Wanted, no substantial leads surfaced. The authorities were stumped. They had no solid clues, and the trail quickly went cold. For years, Joy and Carl were left to mourn the loss of their child, never knowing what had become of her. After abducting Carlina, Ann Petway, who had previously suffered multiple miscarriages and was desperate to have a child of her own, raised the stolen infant to believe she was her biological daughter. She moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut, just 45 minutes from New York City, and renamed Carlina to Nedra Nance, calling her Nettie for short. Under this new identity, Carlina grew up believing Petway was her biological mother. However, Carlina always felt something was off. Petway's story about her birth never quite made sense, and she couldn't provide a birth certificate or any other official documents. As Carlina entered her teenage years, her suspicions grew. Despite her doubts, Carlina continued to live her life as Nedra Nance. She attended school, made friends, and eventually fell pregnant herself. But the gnawing feeling that she was not who she thought she was persisted. In 2010, driven by these doubts and the need to secure proper medical care for her own unborn child, Carlina began to search for answers and ended up confronting Petway, who broke down and confessed that Carlina was not her biological daughter. However, she continued to lie about the circumstances around Carlina's birth and adoption. Carlina's ongoing search for her true identity led her to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children website. There, she came across a photo of a baby who had been abducted from Harlem Hospital in 1987. The resemblance between herself and the digitally aged photo was striking. Carlina contacted the NCMEC, and through a series of phone calls, was eventually connected with Joy White, who was understandably cautious but hopeful. DNA testing soon confirmed what Carlina had suspected. She was indeed the long-lost Carlina White. In January 2011, Carlina was reunited with her biological parents, Joy and Carl. The reunion was bittersweet, filled with joy, but also the pain of lost years. Carlina had grown up in a different world, away from her biological family, and adjusting to her new reality was challenging for everyone involved. The discovery of Carlina White's true identity sent shockwaves through the media and the public. Her case was one of the few where a kidnapped child had managed to find her way back to her family after so many years, largely through her own efforts. The story captivated the nation, and Carlina's strength and determination were widely praised. Ann Petway, who had raised Carlina as Nedra Nance, turned herself into authorities shortly after the case was reopened. She was charged with kidnapping, and in 2012 was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Petway expressed remorse during her sentencing, but the damage had been done. Her actions had torn apart one family and created a web of lies and confusion for Carlina. The relationship between Carlina and her biological parents has been complex. While they were overjoyed to have their daughter back, the years of separation had created a distance that was difficult to bridge. Carlina, too, struggled with her identity, torn between the woman who raised her and the family she had been taken from. Despite these challenges, Carlina has shown remarkable resilience, continuing to build her life and raise her own child with the strength that helped her uncover the truth and solve her own kidnapping. Number 14. The disappearance and reappearance of Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes. Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes was born on September 24, 1977, in the town of Hauula on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. His mother, Charlotte Moriarty, was a free-spirited woman with a complicated past, including a history of mental illness. Marks's father, Mark Barnes, was an Australian national who had moved to Hawaii. Their relationship was tumultuous, and it wasn't long before Charlotte and Mark separated, with Charlotte retaining custody of their young son. On June 21, 1977, when Marks was just 5 months old, Charlotte took him for a walk around their neighborhood. It was a routine activity, and no one suspected that this day would be any different. However, Charlotte and Marks did not return home that day. Concerned after not hearing from them, Mark Barnes reported them missing, setting off a search that would span across the island. Despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, including a public appeal for information, no trace of Charlotte or Marks was found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Unbeknownst to Mark and the authorities, Charlotte had taken Marks and wandered far from the home. At some point, she came into contact with a couple who, believing she needed help, offered assistance. Charlotte gave the couple a false name and claimed that Marks was her adopted son. She then handed over the infant to a local social worker, citing that she could not take care of him. From there, Marks was placed in the Hawaiian foster care system, eventually being adopted by a couple who named him Tenzin Agiman. This new name and identity would be the first of many that Marks would assume over the years. Marks was eventually adopted by Steve and Pat Carter, a loving couple who lived in New Jersey. They renamed him William Stephen Steve Carter Jr. and raised him as their own. Steve grew up in a happy home, unaware of his true origins. His adoptive parents provided him with a stable and loving environment, and for most of his life, Steve had no reason to question his identity. However, as he grew older, certain inconsistencies and curiosities began to emerge. Steve had always known that he was adopted, but his curiosity about his biological origins grew over time. The fact that his adoption records were sealed, a common practice in many cases, only fueled his desire to learn more about his past. In 2011, Steve came across a story about Carlina White, a woman who had discovered she had been kidnapped as an infant and raised by another family. Inspired by Carlina's story, Steve decided to dig deeper into his own past. Steve's investigation began with a simple Google search. He found a website that listed missing children and decided to browse through the profiles. As he scrolled, one particular entry caught his eye, a composite image of what Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes might look like as an adult. The resemblance to himself was uncanny. Stunned, Steve began to piece together the details of the missing child's case, noting the similarities in birth date, location, and other identifying information. Steve reached out to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, to inquire about the possibility that he might be the missing child from Hawaii. The organization quickly arranged for a DNA test, which confirmed that Steve Carter was indeed Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes, the infant who had disappeared with his mother over 3 decades earlier. The news was both shocking and exhilarating for Steve, who had never imagined that his search for answers would lead to such a profound revelation. The discovery of Steve's true identity brought a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, he was relieved to finally know the truth about his origins. On the other hand, he was faced with the reality that his biological family had spent decades wondering about his fate. Steve's adoptive parents were supportive throughout the process, understanding the importance of the discovery for their son. Steve eventually made contact with his biological father, Mark Barnes, who had never stopped thinking about his missing son. The reunion was emotional and bittersweet, as Mark recounted the years of uncertainty and feelings of loss. Unfortunately, Charlotte Moriarty was never found, and her fate remains unknown to this day. The question why Marks and what happened was missing years continue to linger. The case Panama Moriarty Barnes, later known as Steve Carter. Several intriguing questions and theories. One theory suggests that Charlotte Moriarty, struggling with mental illness, may have become overwhelmed by her circumstances and decided to leave her old. Her decision to hand Marks over to authorities under a false name indicates a desire to protect him. Midway. Another theory posits that Charlotte may have planned to return for Marks, but was unable to do so due to unforeseen circumstances. Also underscores the importance of technology and databases, like the one NCMEC maintains, solving long-standing mysteries. The availability of online resources and the ability to connect dots, Steve Carter's true identity might have remained forever. His story remains an amazing example of one man's quest for truth and familial connection. Number 13. The murder of Bobby Worley. Bobby Worley, born in 1938, lived a troubled life that was marred by violence and crime. His criminal record began in the 1960s when he was convicted of raping a woman in Harlem. After serving time in prison, Worley disappeared, becoming an anonymous figure in the bustling and chaotic landscape of New York City. Little did anyone know that his disappearance was the beginning of a bizarre and macabre tale. Doreen Corey, a renowned drag queen and performer, was a fixture of the New York City drag scene from the 1960s through the 1980s. She gained prominence not only for her performance and skill, but also for her role in the legendary documentary Paris is Burning, which highlighted the lives of drag queens and the underground ballroom culture in New York City. Corey was known for her elegance, talent, and wit, becoming a mentor and mother figure to many in the drag community. In August 1993, Corey passed away from AIDS-related complications. Following her death, a friend named Lois Taylor was tasked with sorting through Corey's belongings in her Harlem apartment. Among the costumes, wigs, and personal items, Taylor stumbled upon something that would forever alter the legacy of the drag icon: a large, heavy trunk. Inside the trunk, wrapped in layers of fabric, was the mummified body of a man. The body had been wrapped in imitation leather and stuffed into the trunk, which had been sealed with duct tape. The discovery was both shocking and horrifying. The police were immediately called, and the investigation into the identity of the body began. The body was eventually identified as that of Bobby Worley, the man who had vanished from the streets of New York decades earlier. The autopsy revealed that Worley had died from a gunshot wound to the head, likely inflicted at close range. His body had been in the trunk for approximately 15 to 20 years, meaning that he had been killed sometime in the late 1960s or early 1970s. The trunk and its contents had remained in Doreen Corey's possession for all that time, hidden away in her apartment. The discovery of Worley's body raised numerous questions. How had the body ended up in Corey's apartment? What was the nature of the relationship between Corey and Worley? And most importantly, who was responsible for Worley's death? One theory suggests that Worley may have been involved in an altercation with Corey, possibly as the result of a robbery or assault. Corey, who was known to carry a gun for protection, may have shot Worley in self-defense. Fearing the repercussions of going to the police, especially given the stigma and lack of social protections surrounding the LGBTQ+ community at the time, Corey may have decided to conceal the body. Another theory posits that Worley and Corey had some sort of personal relationship that ended in tragedy. Given Worley's history of violence, it's possible that he posed a threat to Corey or someone close to her, leading to his death. However, without any concrete evidence or testimony, these theories remain speculative. What makes the case even more intriguing is the fact that Dorian Corey never mentioned the incident to anyone, not even her closest friends. She carried the secret of Bobby Worley's death with her until the day she died, leaving behind a mystery that would only be uncovered by chance. The discovery of Worley's body in Corey's closet has led to much speculation about her life and the potential dark secrets she may have harbored. While Corey is remembered as a trailblazing figure in the drag community, the revelation of the mummified body has added a layer of complexity to her legacy. It raises questions about the dual lives that some individuals lead, and the lengths to which they may go to protect themselves or others. Today, the case remains officially unsolved, with no definitive answers as to exactly how and why Bobby Worley was killed. The bizarre circumstances of his death and the years he spent hidden away in Corey's apartment have cemented this case as one of New York City's most peculiar and enduring mysteries. The intersection of glamour and violence, of public persona and private secrets, continues to captivate those who hear the story of the murder of Bobby Worley and the shocking discovery in the closet of Dorian Corey. Number 12. Gary Robb. Blanche Kimball was a 70-year-old woman who lived alone in a modest home in Augusta. She was well known in her community as a kind, elderly woman who had spent her life working hard and living quietly. On June 12, 1976, Kimball was found brutally murdered in her home. She had been multiple times in a vicious attack, and the scene inside her house was horrific. The violence of the crime shocked the small community of Augusta, a place where such brutality was virtually unheard of. The initial investigation into Kimball's murder was intense. Detectives scoured the crime scene for evidence, interviewed numerous witnesses, and followed up on several leads. Among those questioned was Gary Robb, a local man who had done odd jobs for Kimball and had a reputation as a drifter. At the time, however, there was no direct evidence linking Robb to the crime, and he was not considered a primary suspect. Despite their efforts, the police were unable to solve the case, and over time, it went cold. The brutal murder of Blanche Kimball became one of the many unsolved mysteries that haunt small towns across America. Gary Robb, born Gary Robert Wilson, had a troubled past. He was a drifter who spent much of his life moving from place to place, often living on the fringes of society. He had a history of petty crime and substance abuse, but nothing in his record suggested he was capable of the kind of violence that had been inflicted upon Blanche Kimball. After the murder, Robb left Maine and spent the next several decades living a transient lifestyle, primarily on the West Coast. He had numerous run-ins with the law, but these were mostly for minor offenses. For years, Robb lived under the radar, a ghost who might have escaped justice if not for the persistence of the detectives working on Kimball's case. In the early 2000s, cold case investigators in Maine began re-examining unsolved cases, hoping that advancements in DNA technology might provide new leads. The Kimball case was one of those that they revisited. Investigators had preserved DNA evidence from the crime scene, including blood samples that did not belong to the victim. This DNA was entered into national databases, but for years there were no matches. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved. Then, in 2012, a breakthrough came. By this time, Rob was living on the streets of Seattle, Washington. He was a shadow of his former self, struggling with homelessness and substance abuse. Despite the decades that had passed, cold case investigators had not forgotten about him. They still considered Rob a potential suspect in the Kimball case, but needed a way to obtain his DNA to confirm their suspicions. This presented a significant challenge because Rob was not in custody, and investigators had no legal grounds to compel him to provide a sample. Enter the chewing gum. Investigators devised a clever plan to obtain Rob's DNA without his knowledge. They posed as marketing researchers conducting a survey on chewing gum and approached Rob on the street in Seattle. They offered him a piece of gum to chew as part of the survey, and Rob, unaware of the ruse, accepted. After chewing the gum, he handed it back to the investigators, who promptly sent it to a forensic lab for analysis. The DNA extracted from the gum was a match to the DNA found at the scene of Blanche Kimball's murder. This breakthrough was nothing short of extraordinary. It was the key piece of evidence that had eluded investigators for decades. With the DNA match in hand, police arrested Gary Robb in October 2012, charging him with the murder of Blanche Kimball. The arrest made headlines, not only because investigators had solved a 36-year-old cold case, but also because of the innovative method used to gather the crucial DNA evidence. Rob was extradited to Maine to stand trial. Throughout the legal proceedings, he maintained that he had no memory of the crime and suggested that he might have been under the influence of drugs or alcohol at the time. The court proceedings revealed that Rob had indeed been questioned during the initial investigation in 1976, but at that time, there had been insufficient evidence to charge him. Faced with the overwhelming DNA evidence, Rob eventually pleaded guilty to manslaughter as part of a plea deal. The plea deal was seen as a way to bring some closure to the case, without the need for a lengthy and potentially traumatic trial for Kimball's family. In court, Rob confessed to killing Kimball, but claimed he could not recall the details of the crime, further suggesting that his actions may have been influenced by his substance abuse issues. The plea deal brought an official end to the case, but it did not end the pain and grief that had been felt by Blanche Kimball's family and the Augusta community for so many years. While the case was solved, the resolution was bittersweet. The brutal manner in which Kimball was killed, coupled with the fact that her murderer had lived freely for decades, left many with mixed emotions. For some, there was relief that justice had finally been served. For others, there was anger and frustration that had taken so long to bring the killer to justice. Gary Robb was sentenced to 20 years in prison for manslaughter. However, he would not serve his full sentence. In June 2016, Rob died of lung cancer while still incarcerated. His death closed the final chapter on a case that had haunted many for decades. Number 11. The death of Peter Porco. Peter Porco was a 52-year-old law clerk who lived in Delmer, New York, with his wife Joan. The couple had 2 sons, Jonathan and Christopher. On the morning of November 15, 2004, Peter Porco failed to show up for work. Concerned, his colleagues called the police, who arrived at the Porco residence to perform a welfare check. What they found inside was a scene of unimaginable horror. Peter Porco was found dead in his home, his body severely mutilated by repeated blows from an axe. Astonishingly, despite his fatal injuries, it appeared that Peter had risen from his bed after the attack and attempted to go about his morning routine. He managed to walk downstairs, retrieve the newspaper, and even begin making breakfast before succumbing to his injuries. This bizarre behavior became known as the death walk, and it puzzled investigators and medical professionals alike. Joan Porco, Peter's wife, was also found at the scene, barely alive, and suffering from severe head injuries. She had been attacked in her bed and was left in a coma. Despite her critical condition, Joan survived the brutal assault, though the extent of her injuries would leave her with permanent disabilities and severe memory loss. As investigators began piecing together the events of that night, they quickly turned their attention to the Porco's younger son, Christopher. At the time, Christopher was a 21-year-old student at the University of Rochester. He was known to have a strained relationship with his parents, particularly over financial matters. Peter and Joan had reportedly caught Christopher forging his father's name on a loan document, and they were pressuring him to take responsibility for his actions. On the night of the attack, Christopher claimed he was sleeping in his dorm room, but phone records and surveillance footage showed otherwise. Surveillance footage from a toll booth captured a yellow Jeep Wrangler, which resembled the car Christopher owned, heading toward the Porco residence on the night of the murder. Furthermore, records indicated that someone had disabled the home's alarm system using the master code, a code that only the immediate family knew. Despite this circumstantial evidence, the case against Christopher Porco was far from airtight. The most damning piece of evidence came from Joan Porco herself. When first responders arrived at the scene, they asked Joan if she knew who had attacked her. Despite her injuries and altered state, Joan reportedly nodded when asked if her son Christopher was responsible. However, as Joan recovered, she vehemently denied that her son was the attacker and maintained his innocence throughout the trial, standing by her younger child. Christopher Porco was arrested and charged with second-degree murder for the death of his father and attempted murder for the attack on his mother. The trial, which began in 2006, was highly publicized and captivated the nation. The prosecution argued that Christopher had driven home from his university in the middle of the night, murdered his father with an axe, and then attempted to murder his mother before returning to his dorm room to establish an alibi. The defense, on the other hand, argued that the case against Christopher was purely circumstantial. They pointed out the lack of direct evidence linking him to the crime scene, such as fingerprints or DNA. They also questioned the reliability of Joan's initial identification of her son as the attacker, given her traumatic brain injuries and subsequent memory loss. Ultimately, the jury found Christopher Porco guilty on both charges. He was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. The case remains controversial, with some continuing to doubt Christopher's guilt, while others believe justice was served. Joan Porco, to this day, stands by her son's innocence, adding to the complexity of the case's legacy. Number 10. The corpse at the Elegante Hotel. Greg Flanagan was a 55-year-old successful oilman from Lafayette, Louisiana. He was well respected in his field and known as a hard-working, no-nonsense individual. In September 2010, he checked into room 348 of the MCM Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas, for a routine business trip. It was a night like any other for Flanagan. After a day of meetings, he returned to his hotel room, bought a candy bar from the vending machine, and settled in to watch TV. The next day, Flanagan was supposed to check out, but he never did. Concerned, his wife Susie Flanagan called the hotel, which sent a staff member to check on him. What they found was a nightmare. Greg Flanagan was dead, lying on the floor next to his bed, fully dressed. The scene was confusing for the police and first responders who arrived. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious cause of death, and no indication that anything was amiss. Flanagan appeared to have simply dropped dead. Initial assumptions leaned towards a natural cause, perhaps a heart attack. However, as the investigation progressed, the case grew increasingly strange. An autopsy revealed a shocking detail. Flanagan had died from internal injuries caused by blunt force trauma. His ribs were broken, and his internal organs were severely damaged. The injuries were consistent with someone being struck by a powerful blow or a severe accident, but there were no external marks or bruises on his body. It was as if the force had come from within. The perplexing nature of the injuries made it clear that Flanagan's death was no accident. It was a homicide. The room itself provided few clues. There was no evidence of a struggle, no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen. The door was locked from the inside, and nothing in the room suggested any kind of altercation. It was as if Flanagan had been attacked by an invisible force. Investigators were at a loss, and the case seemed to stall. Determined to find out what happened to her husband, Susie Flanagan hired a private investigator named Ken Brennan. Brennan, a former NYPD detective with a reputation for solving difficult cases, took on the case with his usual tenacity. He was immediately struck by the oddity of the situation: the internal injuries with no external wounds, the lack of any disturbance in the room, and the fact that Flanagan had been alone. Brennan meticulously retraced the events leading up to Flanagan's death, interviewing hotel staff, reviewing surveillance footage, and analyzing every detail of the crime scene. He was convinced that the answer lay within the hotel itself. The breakthrough came when Brennan noticed something peculiar about the bullet-like trajectory of Flanagan's injuries. It led him to consider the possibility that the fatal blow had not come from within the room, but from outside it. After re-examining the layout of the hotel, Brennan's theory took shape. He hypothesized that the injury had been caused by a bullet fired from the adjoining room, room 349. The trajectory of the bullet, which had passed through the wall and struck Flanagan, matched the position of the fatal wound. This was no random shooting, however, but a tragic accident. With this theory in hand, Brennan worked with the Beaumont Police Department to confront the men in room 349. Room 349 had been occupied by a group of out-of-town workers, men who had been in Beaumont for a construction project. That night, one of the men, Lance Mueller, had been playing around with a gun. Unbeknownst to him, a round was chambered, and when he pulled the trigger, the bullet passed through the wall and into Flanagan's room, striking him fatally. Mueller and his colleagues had no idea that their reckless behavior had resulted in someone's death. They were completely unaware of the tragedy that had occurred just a few feet away. After questioning, Lance Mueller eventually confessed to the accidental shooting, leading to charges of manslaughter. The case, which had baffled so many for so long, was finally solved. The resolution of Greg Flanagan's death was bittersweet. While the mystery was unraveled and the responsible party was held accountable, it did little to ease the pain of his untimely and senseless death. The case stands as a reminder that a moment of carelessness can have devastating consequences. For the Flanagan family, the resolution of this mystery provided some closure, but it could never replace the loss they had endured. Number 9. The Pretender Christian Gerhardsreiter. Christopher Gerhardsreiter, a man who would later become known as the Great Pretender, was born in Germany in 1961. His life, however, would be defined not by his origins, but by his extraordinary ability to reinvent himself time and again, as he carved for himself a path of deception, crime, and eventually, murder. By the time his lies unraveled, Gerhardsreiter had lived under numerous aliases, the most infamous being Clark Rockefeller, a name that would be repeated in the media as the public uncovered the twisted life of one of America's most notorious con men. In 1978, at the age of 17, Gerhartsreiter arrived in the United States on a tourist visa, ostensibly to pursue the American dream. He quickly realized that to achieve his ambitions, he would need to shed his German identity and adopt a new one. Over the years, Gerhartsreiter assumed several identities, each more elaborate than the last. He charmed his way into elite circles, convincing people that he was a wealthy and well-connected individual. His most successful and audacious persona was that of Clark Rockefeller, whom he claimed to be a member of the prestigious Rockefeller family. As Clark Rockefeller, Gerhartsreiter lived a life of luxury and privilege. He married a successful businesswoman, Sandra Boss, and the couple had a daughter together. For years, Gerhartsreiter's deception went undetected, and he enjoyed the benefits of his fabricated identity. However, his world began to unravel in 2007 when Sandra Boss filed for divorce and gained custody of their daughter. Gerhartsreiter, fearing the loss of his carefully constructed life, kidnapped his daughter during a supervised visit in 2008. This bold act set off a nationwide manhunt that ultimately led to his capture and the exposure of his true identity. As investigators dug deeper into Gerhartsreiter's past, they uncovered a dark and disturbing history. Among the many secrets he had kept hidden was his involvement in a cold case murder that had baffled authorities for decades. In 1985, John Sohus, a man from San Marino, California, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Sohus and his wife Linda had rented a guest house to a man who called himself Christopher Chichester, one of Gerhartsreiter's earlier aliases. Shortly after the couple's disappearance, Chichester vanished as well. The case was unsolved for years, with John Sohus's fate remaining a mystery. It wasn't until 1994 that his remains were discovered buried in the backyard of the property where he had lived. By that time, Gerhartsreiter had long since moved on, assumed his Rockefeller persona, and began living on the East Coast. Despite the discovery of the body, there were few leads in the case, and it grew cold once again. It wasn't until Gerhartsreiter's arrest in 2008, following the kidnapping of his daughter, that authorities began to connect the dots. As they pieced together his history of deception and criminal activity, they realized that the man they had in custody was the same individual who had been living in the guest house when John Sohus disappeared. In 2011, Gerhartsreiter was charged with Sohus's murder. During his trial in 2013, prosecutors presented evidence that Gerhartsreiter had killed John Sohus and buried his body in the backyard before fleeing California. They argued that he had murdered Sohus to maintain his cover and eliminate any potential threats to his fabricated identity. Gerhartsreiter, true to form, continued to deny his involvement in the crime, insisting his innocence even as the evidence mounted against him. The trial was a media sensation, with the public fascinated by the story of a man who had lived so many lives, each more fantastical than the last. In the end, the jury found Gerhartsreiter guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. The case marked the final unraveling of the elaborate web of lies that Gerhartsreiter had spun over the years. Gerhartsreiter's story is one of the most bizarre and intriguing in modern criminal history. His ability to assume new identities and manipulate those around him allowed him to evade detection for years, but it also led to his downfall. The murder of John Sohus, a crime that might have gone unsolved had Gerhartsreiter not been so determined to maintain his false life, ultimately brought his reign of deception to an end. Number 8. The Vanishing Village of Angakuni Lake. The Vanishing Village of Angakuni Lake is one of the most perplexing and eerie mysteries in Canadian folklore. This bizarre tale, which has intrigued and frightened people for decades, involves the complete disappearance of an entire Inuit village near Angakuni Lake in Canada's Nunavut territory. Despite the dramatic nature of the story, it remains shrouded in uncertainty, with elements of truth, exaggeration, and legend intertwined. The legend begins in November 1930, when a Canadian fur trapper named Joe LaBelle was reportedly seeking shelter from the cold in a village near Angakuni Lake. LaBelle was familiar with the area and had visited the village before, so he was expecting to find warmth and companionship among the Inuit inhabitants. However, what he discovered was nothing short of chilling. As LaBelle approached the village, he was struck by an eerie silence. The once thriving settlement was now completely deserted. Homes were left empty, and there was no sign of the villagers anywhere. It was as if they had all simply vanished into thin air. LaBelle's account described several disturbing details. The village's food supplies were left untouched, indicating that the villagers had not planned to leave in haste. Even more unsettling, LaBelle claimed that he found half-prepared meals still hanging over cold fireplaces, as if the villagers had suddenly stopped what they were doing and disappeared. LaBelle also noticed that the village's sled dogs, crucial for survival in the harsh northern climate, had starved to death and were buried under a blanket of snow. But perhaps the most mysterious and horrifying discovery was that of an empty grave, which appeared to have been dug up. The body, which should have been there, was missing. LaBelle, understandably terrified by what he saw, immediately reported his findings to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The story of the vanishing village quickly spread, capturing the public's imagination. According to some reports, the RCMP launched an investigation into the disappearance, but what they found, or whether they found anything at all, remains unclear. Over time, the tale grew, with some versions claiming that strange lights were seen in the sky over the lake around the time of the disappearance, leading to theories of extraterrestrial involvement. As the story spread, so did the theories about what could have caused the disappearance of the Angakuni villagers. One of the most popular theories suggests that the villagers were victims of a mass abduction by extraterrestrials. This idea is fueled by the reports of strange, pulsating lights seen in the sky over Angakuni Lake, which some believe could have been UFOs. According to this theory, the villagers were taken aboard an alien spacecraft, leaving no trace of their whereabouts. Another theory is that the disappearance was caused by supernatural forces. The Inuit people have a rich tradition of folklore involving spirits and otherworldly beings, and some suggest that the villagers may have been taken by spirits or crossed into another dimension. This idea is supported by the eerie circumstances surrounding the disappearance, such as the undisturbed food left at the camp and the body that seemed to have been taken from its grave. Skeptics, however, argue that the entire story may have been fabricated, or at least greatly exaggerated. Some researchers have pointed out that there is little to no official documentation of the event, and that many details of the story come from secondhand accounts or sensationalized newspaper reports. The RCMP, for example, has no record of an investigation into a vanishing village at Angakuni Lake, leading some to question whether the event ever happened at all. One theory suggests that the story was a hoax, or a tall tale that grew out of a misunderstanding or miscommunication. It's possible that LaBelle did visit an abandoned village, but that the villagers had simply moved on to another location, as many nomadic Inuit communities did. The strange details, such as the missing body and the starved dogs, may have been added later to make the story more dramatic and compelling. Despite these doubts, the story of the vanishing village of Angakuni Lake remains a popular and oft-repeated mystery tale. The lack of concrete evidence has only added to its allure, allowing people to speculate and imagine what might have happened to the villagers. The tale has become a part of Canadian folklore, as for many familiar with the vast, unforgiving North, the disappearance of an entire community of people does not seem far-fetched. Number 7. The Gray Man of Pawleys Island. The Gray Man of Pawleys Island is a spectral figure deeply ingrained in the folklore of South Carolina's coastal regions. The story of this ghostly apparition has been passed down through generations, captivating both locals and visitors with its eerie yet seemingly protective presence. The Gray Man is said to appear before major hurricanes, warning residents to seek safety, and has become a symbol of both mystery and survival along the South Carolina coast. The legend of the Gray Man dates back to 1822, though some accounts suggest it could be even older. According to the most widely accepted version of the story, the Gray Man was once a young man who was deeply in love. He was riding to see his fiancée on Pawleys Island, eager to reunite with her after a long absence. As he made his way through the marshes, tragedy struck. His horse became mired in quicksand, and both horse and rider were swallowed by the treacherous ground, never to be seen alive again. Devastated by the loss, the young woman mourned deeply. Shortly thereafter, she began to see a spectral figure dressed in gray near her home. The figure, which she believed to be her lost love, would appear before storms, seemingly trying to protect her. Each time the Gray Man appeared, the woman and her family would heed his silent warning, leaving the island before disaster struck. Incredibly, their home was always spared from the worst of the storms. Over the years, sightings of the Gray Man have been reported by numerous residents and visitors to Pawleys Island. The ghostly figure is always described as a man dressed in old-fashioned gray clothing, sometimes seen walking along the beach or standing silently on a dune. His appearance is said to be a harbinger of hurricanes or other severe weather, and those who see him are believed to be under his protection if they heed his warning and evacuate. One of the most famous sightings occurred in September 1989, just before Hurricane Hugo, one of the most devastating hurricanes to ever hit the South Carolina coast. A local couple reported seeing a man dressed in gray on the beach as they were preparing to leave their home ahead of the storm. They said the figure suddenly vanished before their eyes, leaving them shaken but determined to evacuate. When they returned after the hurricane had passed, they found their home undamaged, while neighboring houses had been severely battered by the storm. The story of the Gray Man has continued to evolve over the years, with each new sighting adding to the legend. Some believe the Gray Man is the spirit of the young lover, eternally bound to Pawleys Island, while others think he might be a guardian spirit protecting the island and its inhabitants. Theories about his identity range from a tragic sailor lost at sea to a Confederate soldier who perished during the Civil War. Despite the numerous accounts of the Gray Man, there is little physical evidence to support the existence of such a ghost. However, the consistency of the sightings and the protection associated with them have made the Gray Man a beloved figure in local culture. His appearances are often seen as a good omen, a sign that while a storm may be coming, those who see him will be safe if they heed his warning. Skeptics argue that the Gray Man is simply a product of folklore, a story created to explain the unpredictable nature of hurricanes and the random devastation they bring. They suggest that the sightings could be attributed to tricks of the light, shadows on the beach, or even the power of suggestion, with people seeing what they expect or want to see during times of heightened anxiety. However, for the residents of Pawleys Island, the Gray Man is more than just a story. He's a symbol of hope and protection in the face of nature's fury, a reminder that sometimes there are forces beyond our understanding that look out for us. Whether a benevolent spirit, a figment of collective imagination, or something else entirely, the Gray Man remains an integral part of the island's heritage, a mysterious figure who continues to watch over Pawleys Island and its people as hurricane season comes and goes. Number 6. The Devil's Footprints. The mystery of the Devil's Footprints is one of the most enduring and puzzling unsolved phenomena in the United Kingdom, dating back to the winter of 1855 in the English county of Devon. On the morning of February 9, 1855, the residents of several towns and villages in Devon awoke to find a strange and inexplicable trail of footprints in the snow. These footprints, unlike anything anyone had ever seen before, appeared to stretch for miles across the countryside, traversing through towns, over rooftops, and across rivers. The bizarre nature of the footprints, combined with the length and continuity of the trail, quickly sparked widespread panic and speculation, giving rise to the legend of the Devil's Footprints. The footprints themselves were described as being hoof-like, approximately 4 inches long, 3 inches wide, and spaced about 8 to 16 inches apart. What made them particularly strange was that they appeared to be in a single line, as though made by a two-legged creature, rather than the more typical staggered pattern of a four-legged animal. The trail of footprints reportedly extended for over 100 miles, crossing a variety of terrains that included rooftops, walls, and even haystacks, without any apparent disruption to their pattern. The phenomenon quickly became the talk of the town, with people from all over Devon and beyond discussing and speculating about the origins of the footprints. The unusual and seemingly impossible nature of the tracks led many to believe that they were not of this world. In the deeply religious Victorian society of the time, the most popular explanation was that the footprints were made by none other than the devil himself. This belief was reinforced by the fact that the prints seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to traverse any obstacle, including moving in straight lines over rooftops and across bodies of water. Local clergy and townspeople were so alarmed by the footprints that they began to pray for protection and search for more rational explanations. However, none of the attempts to explain the footprints were entirely satisfactory. The idea that a single animal, or even a group of animals, could create such an extensive and uniform trail was quickly dismissed, and other theories, such as those involving birds, equally implausible given the sheer scale and the peculiar characteristics of the tracks. As news of the footprints spread, various theories were proposed by contemporary scientists, skeptics, and curious onlookers. One theory suggested that the tracks could have been caused by a weather phenomenon known as hoarfrost, which can sometimes create unusual patterns in snow. However, this theory did not account for the uniformity and consistency of the footprints, nor the fact that they appeared to pass through obstacles like walls and rivers without interruption. Another theory put forward by some investigators was that the footprints were made by hopping rodents, such as kangaroo rats, which might leave a similar pattern when moving through snow. This idea, however, was also discounted due to the length of the trail and the fact that no such animals were known to inhabit the region. One of the more outlandish explanations suggested that the footprints were created by a balloon dragging a tethered object along the ground as it drifted across the countryside. While this might explain the straight-line nature of the tracks, it does not account for the distinctive hoof-like shape of the prints, or their ability to cross over rooftops and walls without leaving a break in the trail. Despite these numerous theories, no definitive explanation for the footprints has ever been found. The mystery has remained unsolved for over 150 years, with each new generation of researchers and enthusiasts offering their own ideas and interpretations. The story has been passed down through the generations, with many embellishments and variations added over time. Some by someone with the means to produce such an elaborate and widespread pattern. However, there is no evidence to support this idea, and the logistics of creating such an extensive and consistent trail would be incredibly challenging, even with today's technology. Number 5. The disappearance of Sneha Ann Phillip. Sneha Ann Phillip was born in Kerala, India, and moved to the United States with her family when she was a child. She was a bright and ambitious young woman who pursued a career in medicine, eventually graduating from the Chicago Medical School. Sneha married Ron Lieberman, also a physician, and the couple lived in Battery Park City, Manhattan, just blocks away from the World Trade Center. On the surface, Sneha and Ron seemed to have a happy and fulfilling life, both enjoying successful careers in the medical field. On September 10, 2001, Sneha was reportedly last seen on security footage at a Century 21 department store near the World Trade Center. She had taken the day off from her residency at St. Vincent's Hospital, allegedly to run errands and meet a friend. The footage shows her casually browsing the store, then purchasing several items, including lingerie, a dress, and bedding. She then left the store and walked out of view, disappearing into the crowded streets of Manhattan. This was the last confirmed sighting of Sneha. When Ron returned home that evening, he found their apartment empty, which was not unusual as Sneha would sometimes stay out late or spend the night with friends. However, when she still hadn't returned the following morning, and after the terrorist attacks occurred, Ron began to worry. In the chaos that followed the attacks, many people were unaccounted for, and Ron hoped that Sneha might have gotten caught up in the confusion and was helping with the rescue efforts as a doctor. He spent the next several days searching hospitals and morgues, hoping for any sign of his wife, but she was nowhere to be found. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the search for Sneha became more desperate. Initially, it was believed that she had died during the 9/11 attacks, perhaps while attempting to help those injured in the towers. This theory was supported by her proximity to the World Trade Center and her natural instinct as a doctor to assist in emergencies. However, as time passed and no trace of her was found in the wreckage, doubts began to arise about whether she had perished in the attacks at all. The official investigation into Sneha's disappearance revealed troubling details about her life leading up to September 10th. It was discovered that she had been suspended from her residency at Cabrini Medical Center a few months earlier due to issues with alcohol and absenteeism. There were also allegations that she had been involved in a dispute with a colleague, which further complicated her professional life. Friends and family, however, described Sneha as a kind and caring person, and her husband Ron staunchly defended her character. Theories about what into two main possibilities. The first theory is that Sneha did indeed perish in the 9/11 attacks, possibly while aiding victims near the towers. This theory was bolstered by reports from Ron that she had a tendency to stay out late and sometimes engage in risky behavior. He also mentioned that she would often spend time with friends or even strangers, helping them with their problems. In this scenario, Sneha could have easily found herself too close to the towers on the morning of September 11th, either by coincidence or by responding to the disaster. The second theory is that Sneha met with foul play on the night of September 10th, and that her disappearance had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. Investigators found that Sneha had been having marital difficulties, with Ron admitting that they had argued the night before her disappearance. Some speculated that she may have encountered someone dangerous after leaving the Century 21 store, and that her body was disposed of before the attacks, with the subsequent chaos providing a cover for her disappearance. There were also suggestions that Sneha might have taken the opportunity to disappear intentionally. Some theorized that she was unhappy with her life, and that the 9/11 attacks provided the perfect opportunity to start over. However, this theory seems less plausible given the lack of any evidence that she had planned to leave, or had taken steps to disconnect from her current life or to create a new identity. In 2004, Ron Lieberman petitioned to have Sneha declared a victim of the 9/11 attacks, which would allow him to claim benefits and have her name included on the official list of victims. The case was initially rejected by the New York Medical Examiner, who cited the lack of evidence linking her disappearance to the attacks. However, after a lengthy legal battle, in 2008 a judge ruled in Ron's favor, and Sneha was officially declared a victim of 9/11. Despite the official ruling, the mystery of Sneha Ann Phillips' disappearance remains unsolved. While her name is now listed among the thousands who perished in the attacks, the exact circumstances of her death are still unknown. Was she an unsung hero who rushed to help those in need, only to lose her life in the process? Or was she the victim of a crime that has gone unpunished, her fate obscured by one of the darkest days in American history? The case of Sneha Ann Phillips continues to be a source of speculation and intrigue. It has been featured in numerous documentaries, articles, and podcasts, with each retelling reigniting the debate over what really happened to her. The lack of definitive evidence means that the theories will likely persist, leaving Sneha's family and those who followed her story to grapple with the uncertainty of her fate. Today, Sneha's disappearance remains one of the most perplexing mysteries associated with 9/11. The combination of personal turmoil, potential foul play, and the catastrophic events of that day create a narrative that is as complex as it is tragic. While the official record may list her as a victim of the terrorist attacks, the questions surrounding her final moments ensure that her story will continue to be examined and debated for years to come. Number 4. The ghost plane of the Himalayas. In the vast and treacherous terrain of the Himalayas, mysteries often lie hidden for decades, only to resurface and spur even more questions than answers. One such mystery involves a World War II C-47 transport plane, which vanished without a trace over the Himalayan mountains. The story of its disappearance and the subsequent discovery of its wreckage many years later is a tale that blends historical intrigue with a chilling sense of the unknown. The C-47 was one of many aircraft tasked with the perilous Hump Route during World War II, a supply line that ran from India to China over the Himalayas. This route was infamous for its hazardous conditions, with pilots having to navigate extreme weather, towering peaks, and the constant threat of enemy action. This particular C-47, like many others, never made it to its destination. It disappeared without a trace, leaving behind no clues as to the fate of its crew and passengers. For decades, the plane remained missing, becoming just one of many aircraft lost to the treacherous conditions of the Himalayas and the mercilessness of wartime. Families of the missing crew members, like many military families, were left without closure, and the plane's fate became just one more lingering question mark of many in the annals of World War II history. The mystery took a dramatic turn in 2019, when an expedition, after years of searching, finally located the wreckage of the missing C-47 deep in the Himalayan mountains. The discovery was both a triumph and a puzzle. While the plane's remains were scattered across the rugged landscape, there were no human remains found at the crash site. This unexpected twist led to a surge of speculation and theories. One of the most intriguing theories is that the crew may have survived the crash and attempted to trek out of the mountains on their own. The lack of bodies at the crash site suggested that the crew could have escaped the wreckage, but the harsh conditions of the Himalayas would have made survival nearly impossible. If they did survive the initial crash, where did they go? Did they succumb to the elements shortly after they crashed, their remains scattered and lost in the vast wilderness? Or did they perhaps find shelter and live out their days in some remote part of the mountains, far from civilization? The discovery also led to speculation about the exact circumstances of the crash. What caused the plane to go down in the first place? Was it a mechanical failure, human error, or something more sinister? The wreckage provided some clues, but without the crew or detailed records, the full story may never be known. Adding to the enigma is the fact that the plane's disappearance occurred in an area known for its harsh and unpredictable weather, which could have played a role in both the crash and the crew's fate. The Himalayas have long been a place of mystery, where stories of lost expeditions and ghostly apparitions are part of the local lore. The C-47 story fits neatly into this tradition, a reminder of the many dangers that lurk in these remote mountains. The discovery of the C-47's wreckage also sparked a renewed interest in the many other aircraft lost in the Himalayas during World War II. Could there be more planes out there, hidden away in the mountains, waiting to be found? And if so, what secrets might they hold? Number 3. The Ghost of the Belmez Faces. The mystery of the Belmez Faces, often referred to as the ghosts of the Belmez Faces, began in 1971 in a small, unassuming village in Spain called Belmez de la Moraleda. The case started when Maria Gomez Camara, a resident of the village, noticed a strange stain forming on the concrete floor of her kitchen. As the stain grew, it began to take on a more distinct shape, eventually resembling a human face. What was initially dismissed as an oddity soon turned into a full-blown mystery as more faces began to appear, each with unique features and expressions. The first face, known as La Pava, was destroyed by Maria's husband and son, who removed the section of the floor where it had appeared. However, their efforts were in vain, as a new face emerged shortly after, even more distinct than the first. This phenomenon continued, with new faces materializing over time, some fading away and others becoming more pronounced. The images varied in size, expression, and gender, but all shared an eerie realism that captivated and unsettled those who saw them. The story of the Belmez Faces quickly gained national and international attention, drawing crowds of curious onlookers and paranormal investigators to the Gomez Camara household. The local government and even the Catholic Church took an interest in the phenomenon, sending experts to examine the faces and determine their origin. Despite extensive analysis, no definitive explanation was provided, and the faces continued to appear sporadically over the years. One of the earliest theories suggested that the faces were a result of pareidolia, a psychological phenomenon where people see patterns, such as faces, in random stimuli like clouds, shadows, or stains. Skeptics argued that the human brain is wired to recognize faces, even in the most abstract forms, and that the faces in Belmez were simply the result of this tendency. However, this theory did little to explain why the faces seemed to emerge so distinctly, and why they would disappear and reappear in different forms. Another theory proposed that the faces were a hoax perpetrated by the Gomez Camara family or someone in the village. Some skeptics suggested that the images could have been painted or etched onto the floor using chemicals or other materials, with the intention of attracting attention or perhaps even financial gain. In 1993, a study conducted by the Spanish Journal of Parapsychology tested the concrete floor for traces of paint or pigment, but found none. However, the study did reveal that the floor contained high levels of zinc, lead, and chromium, which led some to speculate that chemical reactions could have played a role in the formation of the faces. A more supernatural explanation proposes that the faces were the result of psychokinesis, a form of telekinesis where a person unconsciously projects their thoughts or emotions onto their surroundings. In this case, it was theorized that Maria Gomez Camara, or someone else in the household, was unknowingly manifesting the faces through intense emotional energy. This theory, while popular among paranormal enthusiasts, remained controversial and was difficult to substantiate with empirical evidence. The discovery of a possible link to ancient burials added a new layer to the mystery. In 1972, during an excavation beneath the house, human remains were found buried under the kitchen floor. This led to speculation that the faces could be related to the spirits of those interred there, possibly trying to communicate with the living. However, after the remains were removed and reburied in a Catholic cemetery, the faces continued to appear, casting doubt on the idea that they were directly connected to the graves below. Some have speculated that the Belmez faces were a manifestation of something even more sinister, such as demonic activity or a curse placed upon the land. This theory gained traction among those who believed that the faces carried a malevolent aura, with some visitors claiming to have felt a deep sense of unease or dread in the house. However, like many of the other theories, this explanation lacked concrete evidence and was largely based on personal experiences and beliefs. The faces continued to appear in the home until Maria Gomez Camara's death in 2004. After her passing, the activity seemed to decrease, though reports of new faces appearing occasionally surfaced. The house has remained a site of interest for paranormal investigators and curious visitors who continue to debate the origins of the mysterious faces. Number 2. The inescapable murder of Billy Greenwood. In April 1995, the quiet community of Portland, Maine was rocked by the brutal and seemingly senseless murder of Billy Greenwood, a father of 4. Billy was known as a man who had made his share of both friends and enemies throughout his life. His past was checkered, with run-ins involving drugs and law enforcement, which had earned him a reputation in certain circles. But despite his complicated history, no one could have anticipated the tragic fate that ultimately awaited him. Billy Greenwood's body was discovered in the open, exposed to the elements, and with no apparent motive for his death. His murder seemed to defy explanation. The overnight rain had washed away any meaningful forensic evidence, leaving the police with little to go on. However, the brutal nature of the crime and Billy's troubled past suggested that the list of potential suspects would be long. It wasn't long before 2 prime suspects emerged, a pair of local brothers with a reputation for toughness and a shared history with Billy. These brothers harbored a grudge against him, believing that he had betrayed them in connection with a drug bust many years earlier. Although Billy had served time because of that incident, he was still thought of as a rat by the brothers. Despite their suspected involvement, the brothers denied any connection to the murder. They even agreed to take polygraph tests, though the results were inconclusive. They both provided an alibi, supported by a taxi driver, and for the time being, they were released back onto the streets. Despite being under suspicion, the brothers were far from quiet about the case. They reportedly boasted about killing Billy to various people around town, but continued to deny their involvement to the police. As the investigation progressed, the police received a tip from a jailhouse informant who claimed to have witnessed one of the brothers murdering Billy. The informant's story was graphic and detailed, but it contained one critical inaccuracy that led the police to dismiss his account. Another jailhouse informant came forward with a more plausible story, but this too led to a dead end. Just when it seemed like the case might remain unsolved, an unexpected lead came in from New Orleans, over 1,600 miles away. A man had a altercation with his girlfriend, during which he ominously threatened to do to her what he had done to that guy in Portland, Maine. He provided key details about the crime, enough to send his girlfriend into a panic. She conducted her own search, and horrified by what she found, contacted the Portland police. The man in question had previously served time with the brothers who were under suspicion, adding a layer of complexity to the investigation. But even this promising lead eventually fizzled out. Then, more than a decade after Billy Greenwood's murder, a stunning development occurred. In 2008, a man named Michael Cutting came forward and confessed to the crime. Cutting, a drifter with no apparent connection to Billy, revealed that the murder was a random act of madness. His confession seemed almost unbelievable given the years that had passed, but it quickly became clear that Cutting was telling the truth. He led the authorities to the location where he had dumped the murder weapon, a rifle that had been submerged in water for years. Remarkably, despite the time and conditions, the weapon could still be positively identified as the one used to kill Billy Greenwood. Investigators pieced together some of Billy Greenwood's final moments. After a run-in with the brothers in a bar, believing he would be killed, he hitchhiked home, getting into Michael Cutting's car, not realizing he had escaped one would-be killer, only to fall into the grasp of another. Cutting's confession shocked the community and the family of Billy Greenwood, who had long sought answers and justice. The randomness of the act made the crime even more difficult to comprehend, as Billy had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Cutting's decision to turn himself in provided closure to a cold case that had haunted Portland for years, but it also left many questions unanswered about why Billy had to die. Cutting ultimately pleaded guilty to the murder, avoiding a lengthy trial. While Cutting's confession brought a measure of closure to Billy's family, it did little to ease the pain and loss felt by those who knew and loved him. The senseless violence that marked Billy Greenwood's death was shocking, but reminds us that justice can eventually be served even under unexpected circumstances. Number 1. The kidnapping of Jamie Claus. Jamie Claus, born on July 13, 2005, to James and Denise Claus, was an only child growing up in Barron, Wisconsin. She was a bright and active girl who loved activities like jazz dancing, ice skating, and playing volleyball. By 8th grade, she had developed a fondness for shopping and indulged in Starbucks Frappuccinos. Her parents, who were known to be a quiet couple, worked together at the Jenny O turkey facility in Barron. The Claus family, which included the three of them as well as their dog Molly, appeared to lead a happy life. However, unknown to them, Jake Patterson was watching and planning something terrible. Born on June 17, 1997, Jake was the youngest of 3 children, raised by parents Patrick, an electrical supply worker, and Deborah, a homemaker. The family lived on a rural property in Wasket, Wisconsin, before Jake's parents divorced in 2007. Throughout high school, Jake was mostly unremarkable, described by classmates as quiet and reserved. He was known to have a small circle of friends, enjoyed reading Tom Clancy thrillers, and was a member of the Quiz Bowl team. However, by his junior year, he began to display signs of a temper and became increasingly isolated. Jake Patterson had always been eager to finish high school and join the Marines, but he was discharged from basic training after just 5 weeks. He struggled to hold down jobs, quitting several after just a few days. In October 2018, while briefly employed at a cheese factory, Jake spotted Jamie Claus boarding a school bus. Though he didn't know her name, he immediately decided that she was the girl he was going to take. Jake meticulously prepared for the kidnapping, stealing his father's shotgun and purchasing items like a face mask and dark clothing. He even sabotaged his car to prevent anyone from escaping from the trunk. He made 2 unsuccessful attempts to abduct Jamie before finally succeeding on his 3rd try. On October 15, 2018, at around 1 a.m., Jake parked near the Claus home. Jamie, awakened by her dog, alerted her parents to the presence of a stranger. James Claus, her father, approached the front door with a flashlight. Jake Patterson, disguised and armed, shot James through the door before forcing his way into the house. Jamie and her mother Denise had barricaded themselves in the bathroom, but Jake broke down the door, killed Denise, and abducted Jamie. The entire ordeal lasted less than 4 minutes. The news of Jamie's kidnapping and her parents' murders shocked the quiet town of Barron and quickly made headlines worldwide. An intense search ensued, with law enforcement and volunteers combing the area for clues, but they found little to go on. Conspiracy theories circulated online, and some speculated that Jamie might have run away, but the police made it clear that Jamie was not a suspect. In reality, Jamie was being held captive by Jake in a remote cabin in Gordon, Wisconsin. For 88 days, she was forced to stay hidden under his bed, with heavy objects blocking her escape. Jake controlled her with threats and isolation, but he never physically assaulted her. Despite the horror of her situation, Jamie remained resilient, waiting for the right moment to escape. That moment came on January 10, 2019. After Jake left the house, Jamie managed to push aside the barriers and fled the cabin. She encountered Jean Nutter, a woman out walking her dog, and pleaded for help. Jean quickly took Jamie to a neighbor's house, and the police were called. Thanks to Jamie's courage, Jake was soon apprehended. He confessed to his crimes, expressing a twisted belief that he had restrained her with fear. Jake Patterson pleaded guilty to the murders and kidnapping in March 2020. He was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years for kidnapping. Jamie, after her harrowing ordeal, was reunited with family members and awarded a $25,000 reward for her bravery. She received recognition from her community and the Wisconsin Assembly for her courage. Jamie's aunt and guardian reflected on the 2-year anniversary of her escape, expressing gratitude for the community's support and Jamie's resilience. Today, Jamie lives with her aunt, while Jake Patterson serves his sentence in a New Mexico prison. Jamie is gradually rebuilding her life, surrounded by loved ones who continue to support her.